Looks like you had a rough night. Yeesh. What's up, everybody? Well, it's Halloween. That means it's time to make something spooky. This year, I wanted to make something totally original that I couldn't buy off the shelf. I've got enough off the shelf Halloween decorations, so this year I wanted to challenge myself to make something new. So, I came up with this spooky cauldron idea. This cauldron runs off of ultrasonic misters, which use water to create this persistent fog effect. That means I don't need any sort of fog juice, just a bucket of water, and this thing will make fog all day and all night. Now, this looks pretty cool in the daytime, but where it really shines is at night. Because nothing says Halloween like scaring your children.
Now, I'm no Boy Scout. I don't know how to tie a tripod. I think there's some sort of fancy in and out weave method, but I don't have time to learn that. I've got a spooky cauldron to make. Instead, you can tie a square knot around all 3 of the sticks, and then take one of them and rotate it 360 degrees, and that locks them all together. One more square knot to tie them together, and you've got a pretty secure tripod. No Boy Scouts needed. Someone should rake up all those pine needles instead of making a cauldron. And now to test it like a proper idiot. I had zero confidence this was going to work. Perfect! If it can hold me, it can hold 5 gallons of water. Now, after 3 trips to Goodwill looking for something that looked like a cauldron, I had no luck. Until the well pump on my house failed. That's not very lucky. But it did give me this giant metal receptacle meant for holding water. So I decided that would be my new cauldron. A very, very, very expensive cauldron. I found that the spookiest cauldrons are about 14 inches tall. Why do I know that? Because I made it up. It was at this point I realized this tank is pressurized and I probably don't want to cut into it with my angle grinder. Crisis averted. Though it would have made a pretty fun video if I would have forgot. Alright, back to making sparks. The edges of this are razor sharp, so I'm going to clean it up with my angle grinder, because a spooky cauldron is a safe cauldron. These stickers have been stuck on for like 30 years. They're not going anywhere. I found the easiest way to take care of them is with a torch. You just burn them to a crisp and scrape what's left. Anything that's left over we can just knock down with 80 grit sandpaper. At this point, I gave it a rough assembly to make sure I was happy with the height. It seems like the right height for a cauldron. The problem is, it's not spooky. It's a friendly blue. Let's change that. Before I can paint this thing's disgusting. So I'm going to hit it with some degreaser and wipe it down and make sure it's ready for paint. As an added bonus, it smells like a pleasant lavender instead of burnt stickers. Our first coat is a gray primer. This will be a good base for all the fancy paint I want to put on it later. There's a few imperfections in the paint job from the stickers, but I'm not too worried about it because I'm going to weather this anyways and make it look old and nasty, so it just adds to the effect. While the primer is drying, I'm going to focus on another part of the cauldron. Every cauldron needs a heating source, so we need to make some spooky embers. I don't know how they're any spookier than normal embers, but, go with it. I'm using a cheap spray foam on top of these Halloween lights that sort of have a flickery fire effect to them. Spray foam already has a translucent effect, so if you put lights underneath it, it's not even painted and it convincingly looks hot. With the primer dry, we can focus back on the cauldron. I cut a bucket in half to create this inner chamber to hold the water, and I'm going to use rigid foam to create a collar to fill the gap between the bucket and the cauldron. This way, I only need about 2 gallons of water, instead of like 10. Now if you've ever cut rigid foam with a razor blade, you know it's not very fun. It's squeaky, it's not very accurate, makes a mess. Instead, I'm using a hot wire foam cutter. It leaves you with buttery smooth cuts that you can actually sand. If you've ever tried to sand rigid foam after you cut it, it doesn't work. With a little bit of fine tuning, we've got a nice compression fit. Now to repeat the process one more time for the inner ring, and we are in business. To glue it up, I'm going to use Gorilla Glue. Gorilla Glue is a foam glue, so it makes sense to glue foam with a foam glue. We'll throw it in some clamps, and we'll let it dry overnight. It's the next day, and everything is glued up pretty well. I did add this PVC spacer at the bottom of the bucket. This will give the bucket some support when there's water in it. Before we can go any further, we have to drill some bung holes. The bung holes are very important. They let the wires for the ultrasonic misters through while keeping the bucket watertight. Everyone knows you want a watertight bung hole. With all the bung holes drilled, now we need some drainage holes in the bottom of the cauldron. I'm starting to think this drill bit might be dull. So let's go ahead and do another rough assembly. We'll feed the cords for the ultrasonic misters through the bung holes, make sure the bungs fit, and then we'll glue in these PVC pipes as a standoff to hold the ultrasonic misters at the correct height. To make the top of this look seamless and ready for paint, we'll use Drydex to fill the gaps between the bucket and the foam. It's kind of like frosting a cake, except don't eat Drydex. I borrowed my wife's hairdryer to speed up the drying process, but now we can focus on something else. With the spray foam dry for the embers, now it's time to seal it. Spray foam is not meant to hold up to the weather, and it's even worse when you try to spray paint it, so it needs some sort of sealant. The easiest way that I've found to seal any sort of foam is Mod Podge. It's like the white glue we all used to eat in elementary school, except with a little more magic. If you water it down to a 1-to-1 ratio, you have a sealant that's perfect for foam and gets it ready for paint. Let's talk about the workhorse of the project, these ultrasonic misters. They vibrate at an extremely high frequency, which creates a fine mist. These ones have pre-built LEDs in them, so they light up and change the color of the mist. The trick to them, though, is to make sure you have the correct water height. Too little water, and they'll just spit water at you. Too much, and they won't do anything. This is why I put the PVC standoffs in the bucket, to keep them at the correct height. This way, there will be enough water in the bucket to last all night, but they'll also be placed high enough so that the mist overflows the cauldron. For this project, I bought 2 different brands. The reason I did this is that when they change colors, I want them to actually go out of sync. I don't want both of them to be blue and red at the same time. I want one to be blue and one to be green, because when they're out of sync, you get way more color combinations. And as we all know, that's way more spooky. Last things last. Let's add these S-hooks to the cauldron. This way, the ropes that suspended up in the air have somewhere to anchor to. With everything glued, sealed, and primed, we're finally ready for a final paint job. It's at this point I realized I catastrophically fucked this up. I'll give you a couple seconds to see if you can figure out what's wrong. Do you see that hole in the bucket? There's not supposed to be a hole in the bucket. Now it can't hold water. When I was drilling the holes for the S-hooks, I must have over-drilled and punctured the bucket. It's times like these when you're so far into a project and something goes so wrong that you're just ready to quit.
Hi, Phil Swift here for Flex Tape, the super strong.
But we don't quit. With that disaster fixed, we can focus back on painting. Our first coat on this is not actually black, it's brown. I'm going to use one of my favorite painting techniques to weather this. Once your base coat is dry, you cover it with hairspray. When the hairspray is still tacky, you throw salt at it. This gives you a nice crusty look, but the technique really comes together once you put your second coat of paint on. I'm using Rust-Oleum's black hammered metallic paints. They're meant for painting over imperfect surfaces, and they leave sort of a dappled, pitted metal look, which is perfect for the look I'm going for. With the paint dry, I come back in with a wet paintbrush and I focus on the areas that I hit with the salt. The water on the paintbrush reactivates the hairspray and starts to dissolve the salt, revealing the brown undercoat. This painting technique gives you a rusty, chipped effect that actually has depth to it. Now that the cauldron is all painted up, it's time to focus our attention on painting the embers. This one is a pretty easy paint job. I'm using a heavy overbrushing technique to paint over the top of the embers. I don't want to force the dark paint into the cracks, because if you look at embers, the hottest area is usually in the recesses, so if I cover that with black paint, the effect won't work. I want the light to shine through the cracks. After our bucket fiasco, it's nice to have a win. A quick clear coat of matte enamel, and this thing is ready for the outside weather, as opposed to the inside weather. Now that I'm happy with the metallic look of the cauldron, now it's time to make it look gross. I'm using a combination of green acrylic paint, gloss Mod Podge, and tacky glue. This combination gives you a terrible snotty paint that dries rock hard, glossy, and will never, ever come off your pants. Ask me why I know. But it does make a very convincing slime. I pulled a few more painting tricks out of my book, using a dark brown wash to make the green a little dirtier, and hitting it with a yellow dry brush to help pick out the highlights. All that's left now is to take it outside and set it up.